Just a little history of my battle with Chiari and Syringomyelia. About probably 16 years ago, I was diagnosed with Syringomyelia when I had a car accident and had a full spine MRI, and they discovered that. And then probably about 5 years ago, I was diagnosed with Chiari 1 malformation. Like many of you, searching for a diagnosis is difficult. You know, you see many neurologists, neurosurgeons, pain specialists, and just to try to find an answer is very difficult. And you're feeling more weak and you're in more pain every day. I think one of the messages I kept hearing was, you're too young, your symptoms aren't indicative of your condition, it's all in your head. So at that point I felt that I had hit a brick wall. I was giving up on trying to find a solution, didn't think I'd find one, was just about ready to give up really on life in general. So I went online and I decided that that was the time I was going to find answers. So at the time, my husband and I, we lived up in Syracuse, New York. So I found the Chiari Institute, went down there, and they based the decision for surgery not on your age, but basically on your quality of life. So the neurologist there handed me a Chronicity scale and said, please rate your quality of life. I scored a 65, not knowing at the time that anything under 70, they would consider doing surgery for you. They also diagnosed me with Ehlers-Danlos syndrome, which is a connective tissue disorder, and tethered cord syndrome. So Ehlers-Danlos, for those that aren't aware, sometimes can manifest similar symptoms as Chiari, so it was causing my brain and my head to compress into my spinal canal. So I had my detethering surgery about 2 months later, and then 3 months after that I had my brain decompression and a cranial cervical fusion for the Ehlers-Danlos. A few months later I hit my head and, well, literally knocked a screw loose, as my family likes to laugh at me for. So I did have it revised about 9 months after that. I mean, I do feel a lot better than when I started the journey. Obviously, I still have symptoms, still battle headaches and neck pain just about on a daily basis. But I returned to work full-time, more than full-time. I'm a CPA, and we probably work 100-hour weeks during our peak time. So I'll continue to really live with the effects, and I think too many of us, children, adults alike, we suffer with the symptoms and trying to search for a diagnosis. As I've heard some of you mention tonight, you see doctors and they think that you're making it up and that it's all in your head, and you know, these conditions can really dominate our lives. So I moved back to Seattle about 3 years ago. I contacted Dorothy Poppy from CSF because I really wanted to help build awareness so that hopefully others could not have the difficult road to diagnosis and treatment that I did. So after 3 years of trying to coordinate schedules and coordinate getting this event together, I'm very pleased to see how many people have shown up tonight. So with that, I would like to turn it over to Dorothy, and she's going to lead us into the vision of CSF.
Thank you so much, Gina. The mission of CSF is to advance knowledge through research and to educate the medical, allied sciences, and lay community about Chiari malformation, Syringomyelia, and related CSF disorders. And as we promised, we are diligently working to fulfill that mission. We've only been here since November of 2007. We now have chapters in New York, Cleveland, Denver, Washington, D.C. Each of these chapters is presenting free quarterly educational regional lectures that are being taped and uploaded to our website. So you can view the lectures from the Cleveland Clinic. You can view the lectures from Duke University. Anyone can access that information. And tonight we're taping here. This is the first time here tonight. So I am so pleased because this Northwest Regional Chapter has been in the workings for, as Sheena said, 3 years. And thank you to Dr. Richard Ellenbogen, whose leadership on our executive board has made this happen. Tonight I encourage each of you to become an active member of this chapter. That doesn't mean go home and forget about it and show up next time. What can each of you do to make this chapter vibrant? You each have a time or talent or funds, something. You have something to give so that others can reap the benefits. And I encourage each of you to think about what that is and join in tonight. On October 1st, we're opening the Carolinas chapter in conjunction with Duke University, and we're going to dedicate that chapter to Dr. Marcy Spear, who is really the first geneticist who actually took an interest in Chiari malformation. She passed away 3 years ago to breast cancer, and we're going to dedicate a garden in her honor and kick off the first CSF chapter down there. CSF is supporting research. There's a study that's been proposed because there appears to be an underserved population of children and adults with Chiari malformation and autism, and the size of which has yet to be determined. Recent data suggests that there's a greater than expected overlap of children diagnosed with both Chiari malformation and autism. So what CSF has proposed is to establish the prevalence of Chiari-related disorders in the population of autism syndrome, to develop clinical biomarkers to more readily select patients within that population, and to determine whether randomized prospective surgical correction of these established neurological disorders provides significant improvement in the neurological function, pain, quality of life of the affected children. So what that is basically we are going to have Duke University, University of Chapel Hill, Cleveland Clinic involved with also people from Georgetown to put this study together. So it's not going to be one institution, it's a collaborative study. We're also collaborating with Conquer Chiari. We've put up money to help fund a conference in Chicago that's going to be held on November 11th and 12th of this year. It basically is a group of engineers who are getting together to solve the problem of Chiari malformation and Syringomyelia. The work that's produced from that will be put up on the website, and you will all be able to view it free of charge. We've had conversations with the National Institute of Health. I've been down there 3 times and met with Katrina Gwynn. Katrina Gwynn is our government representative, and she has now agreed to put together a collaboration between hydrocephalus and hindbrain malformation, which includes Chiari malformation, and we're going to have a symposium to come to consensus, and NINDS is going to pay for that. So we're making progress on the government front. Finally, we're hosting the first CSF Hydrodynamic Symposium on July 8th, 2011, and it's going to be in Zurich, Switzerland. We have engineers and physicists and neurosurgeons coming together from around the world to actually sit down and look at this problem. So we've been busy. If you think about that, in 2 years to start to move all of those projects forward, it's amazing. To do that, we've had to raise money. So in addition to our annual CSF charity ball, which this year grossed $100,000, and our Arlington Race for the Cure, which is about $180,000, just happened in September, we're adding 2 events. And these are exceptional events. The first event is going to be held on November 13th, and it's in Washington, D.C., and it's an international gala, the CSF Night of Light Children's Gala. The patrons for this event include Queen Noor of Jordan, Lord Fairfax of Cameron, the Honorable Christopher Burnham, Lord and Lady Maluk Brown, and Randy Taken. And Randy Taken has been the first sponsor who has stepped up and written a check before anything goes out for $125,000 to start this project. The guest list for this event, which is a really small dinner, it's 100 people, includes major philanthropists from the United States, Hollywood celebrities, international dignitaries, and world-class physicians and scientists who are coming together to raise significant money for research funding. So we're accomplishing two goals with that. We're going to fund our research endowment, and we're also going to spread education and awareness around the world. The other fantastic event that's coming up is the first annual Bobby Jones Classic for CSF, and you can go online and view it. It's www.bobbyjonesclassic.com. It's a professional, a pro-am golf tournament that's being put together by the Peter Jacobson Group. It is going to have Arnold Palmer, Jack Nicklaus, major golfers coming in. We have our first foursome, four foursomes coming in, to give you an idea, at $40,000 apiece. That's before the events turned out to the public. So with all of that, we are moving forward, and what I'd like to share with you tonight is an awareness DVD that is, it's been put together by the Jones Family Foundation, and we use this to create awareness in various places where people really don't understand what Chiari and Syringomyelia are. So I'd like to share with you tonight. Could you spell that for me?
My name is Paul Farrell, and I am the chairman of the board of directors and a founding member of the Chiari and Syringomyelia Foundation.
I'm Dorothy Poppy, the executive director of the Chiari and Syringomyelia Foundation.
If you take a look at Chiari and Syringomyelia, they're very, very obscure disorders, and that's one of the things we consistently need to teach people about what these disorders are.
There's no celebrity, there's nothing that we can do to make this seem like Lou Gehrig's disease or something that is more well known. Right now, we're saddled, Syringomyelia, most people can't even say it.
It's curious to me that there are other disorders and organizations out there who are raising hundreds of millions of dollars for these disorders that afflict a fraction of the people who are afflicted with Chiari and Syringomyelia. So we've got a 9-year-old who's been suffering since the day he was born, and it's just going to get worse for him. And we can do more surgery. But that just makes him suffer more, and there's no proven... There's nothing to prove that the surgery is going to help. It's just more invasive. You could be causing more problems, you know, and it's still not taking the pain away. You know, they're still suffering, and there's no end in sight. And he's 9, and he has the rest of his life to live like this.
For example, there are between 350,000 and 400,000 people affected by multiple sclerosis.
The National Multiple Sclerosis Foundation raises $99 million a year. The federal government gives them an additional $98 million a year.
CM and SM doesn't even make the list. This needs to change.
My son Matt, our oldest, has Chiari malformation and very fortunately as of today does not have Syringomyelia.
When I try to explain to people what Chiari is who don't really have a medical background, I try to say imagine a child with a perfectly normal brain, nothing wrong with their brain, but the house that the brain is in, the skull, is slightly too small.
Like any new parents, we were bewildered just by the experience of a newborn. And he cried a lot, but kids do, right?
I had no capacity to ease his pain.
But by the time Matt was 1 to 18 months, it was clear to us that there were other problems.
But we were very much at the end of our rope after a long, hard 18 months of trying to figure out what was wrong with our son. And our friends and family really knew that we were in trouble.
My wife pointed out to me in photographs that when we would hold Matt, if he was vertical, he was happy, he was smiling, he was just the happiest kid you've ever seen. But he always had a hand up next to his head, literally as if he was holding his head.
You know, we did our homework. We interviewed a bunch of neurosurgeons. I think we interviewed 5. We chose the last neurosurgeon we visited, Dr. John Ruge at Lutheran General, mostly because he was the man that looked at us and said, if this were my own son, I wouldn't let him live one more day thinking that this was life.
The first 90 days or so after surgery were pretty harrowing. And when you think back to all the people that had gone before Matt, and the surgeries that had gone wrong, because this is uncharted waters, it just really tears at your heart.
My name is Bob Jones IV. I'm the grandson of legendary golfer Bobby Jones, the only man to win golf's Grand Slam, all 4 national championships in the same year. He also suffered from Syringomyelia. When he died in 1971, little was known about the disease, little could be done about the disease. Now we do know more. But the reality of it is that research is very expensive. It requires a tremendous amount of capital to conduct medical research, especially of the kind that we need to really learn about this condition. And it's almost more than individual donors can even do. But with the help of individual donors and with the help of corporations who are concerned to make life better for what we estimate to be almost 250,000 people who suffer from this condition, I believe that we can build a base from which solid research can be done, and so that future generations might not have to suffer in silence, as my grandfather did for 25 years.
Bobby Jones was a private man and was reluctant to have Syringomyelia become known as Bobby Jones disease. His family and his grandson Bob Jones IV now recognize the need for a celebrity connection with the disease and with our organization. The family has graciously agreed to allow CSF to exclusively use the Bobby Jones name in association with our organization and in our pursuit of our ultimate goal to find a cure for Chiari and Syringomyelia.
And the work of CSF has become a driving passion for my entire family. When you attend a function of CSF, you meet people from all walks of life, from all corners of the country, all of whom share an experience that my family has been through. We have all either suffered with the disease or watched family members whom we dearly loved suffer with this disease. And I have never been with a group of people in my life that have the passion, the love, and the dedication of the people of the Chiari and Syringomyelia Foundation.
And his family's been extremely generous and lent the name of Bobby Jones, who all golfers recognize and can hopefully identify what he suffered from with what we're trying to raise awareness with today. I see the children and the people that are affected with this giving pennies, quarters, dollars, with the hope that this will add up, inspire other people to be motivated to raise money and help those that have this condition.
I do have a passion for finding the answers to these disorders because I lived on those neurological floors with the kids who are suffering with this. And my son's walking. So I'm grateful, and I'm not going to stop until we find the answers for everyone. We need funds for research to find the answers for pain and for the cure for these disorders. And without your help, we can't do it. Dr. Ellenbogen and I have known each other too many years, I'm thinking, right? Going back to the 90s. He has always been a leader for our group, and he's always managed to find time for his patients, to help with strategic planning, to move the whole organization forward, and we are so grateful to have him on our executive board. So it is with great pleasure that I bring up Dr. Richard Ellenbogen.
Thank you. Now I feel like I'm a leper, so people, come on, move forward. You know, in grand rounds, this is where we have neurological surgery grand rounds, and I don't let any of my residents or students sit past the first 3 rows. So if anybody is willing to move up, that'd be great, because this is an interactive sort of thing. Now I want to point out there are 2 people that are here because they want to be here. So which one is it? 2? Yeah, that's what we'll put. So this is going to be interactive. I want to, first of all, log in. So I first want to thank, there are 2 people in the audience that some of you may recognize. The first one, of course, is my lovely and absolutely essential patient care coordinator, Shannon Wilson, sitting all the way in the back. She didn't move up. She, So, and then, of course, Jim Pridgeon is, he is a part-time photographer, but he's actually the grant writer for the Department of Neurological Surgery. That's what happens when you go to Stanford and get a degree. You end up writing grants to help us get funding from the NIH and other organizations to do this sort of research. I want this to be kind of interactive. I know most of you in the audience, and you certainly know me, and I want to talk a little bit about Chiari and Syringomyelia because I'm passionate about this. I got interested in this in the early 80s when I was still a student, and I heard a lecture by Bernard Williams, the late Bernard Williams, who was one of the fathers of this field trying to understand what causes this. And by the end of the lecture, there was almost a free-for-all of neurosurgeons fighting about what causes it and how do you treat it, what's the proper treatment. And I realized, you know what, this is crazy that no one agrees on this. And at that time, this was pre-MRI, so it was very difficult to diagnose. I said, we're going to come up and figure this out. And of course, 30 years later, I'm still trying to figure out what I don't know. I now know more about what I don't know than what I know. So let's talk a little bit. I want to talk about facts, myths, and failures. I think the thing that really is most shocking to my patients is that they're not perfect again. I think that's a hard thing, that this affects it affects each of you in a very different way, in a very disparate way. What your symptoms are not your symptoms. What your outcome is not your outcome. And I think that's very disturbing, because if you have pneumonia, you expect to be cured. We give you an antibiotic, your pneumonia goes away. If the first antibiotic doesn't work, certainly the second antibiotic would work. If you have an upset stomach, you take something for it, gets better. That is not Chiari and Syringomyelia, and that is very, very disorienting to patients. So I want to talk a little bit about this. Now, this Northwest chapter is very important. What Dorothy has done, Dorothy flew all the way from Staten Island. There's not an airport at Staten Island. She went through New York. She's the executive director of this foundation. I've actually worked with her on this research for probably 2 decades. And this is the area that we cover here. This is the WWAMI area: Washington, Wyoming, Alaska, Montana, and Idaho. This is where you all come from. We have a particular problem, good problem. Out here, I grew up in New York City. I trained in New England and Boston. But this is God's country out here, okay? So it's beautiful, but the problem is it's a very rural population. So you see 27% of the landmass of America is here. And the first problem that my patients have is getting to doctors that take care of this problem. If you're in New York, you can have 10, 20 doctors that take care of this problem. Out in the Northwest, it's just a touch more challenging, like all your medical care. So we understand that, and one thing that we've been trying to do is provide access as best we can to people that are interested in taking care of the whole patient with Chiari and Syringomyelia, because as you all know, it's something that doesn't always end, and it's something that needs chronic attention to, not by just neurological surgeons, but neurologists, internists, pediatricians, whatever. So that's the area that we serve. And so then the other thing, of course, I want you to all know I'm a Mariner and Seahawk fan now that I moved out here. No more Giants and Yankees. That's, you know, that's hard on me. And I'm not here to criticize any other doctors, okay, because believe me, there's a lot I don't know. And I only have a fraction of your answers, unfortunately, because we have a lot to do. So that's one. So just to summarize, when I see patients with failures, when I talk to my patients, there's often a reason for the failures. Either they've had too much surgery, okay? They've had too little surgery, okay? They've had associated anomalies. Maybe you've heard the tethered cord, or connective tissue disease, or hydrocephalus. Some of you out here have a CSF abnormality called hydrocephalus. And then there's errors of diagnosis. So you heard also, you know, you're crazy, you have a psychiatric disease, there's nothing wrong with you, or you don't have Chiari malformation. So those are all the sort of things that I see and that you all experience in terms of failures. So here's just a little survey of the sort of symptoms that I see in patients. Look at this. I mean, you can see it looks like a Chinese menu in the sense that one from column A, one from column B. And no one patient and two patients have the same symptomatology and signs. So some of my last 225 patients I've operated on, 27% of the patients come with a misdiagnosis. So before I'm very critical, this is not an easy condition to diagnose. So 27% of the people said, you know, I was told I had this, and when we spend the time going over your MRI and your history, you actually had Chiari or Syrinx. Okay. So of course, just a little. So what is the classic diagnosis has kind of moved all over the place, but the diagnosis that you will hear most often is a measurement. You all know this. This is a measurement. This is a picture, just a drawing, a cartoon, so to speak, of the skull. And the original definition of what a Chiari malformation, Hans Chiari, being a German anatomist at the turn of the 1900s, that looked at the bottom, the opening in the bottom of the skull, okay, the foramen magnum, and noticed that some people had their cerebellum came through that and was a little droopy. It went below the line that you drew from here to here. And that's what the definition, the original definition of a Chiari malformation 100 years ago was. Here's a definition of Syrinx. Here you see Syrinx. This is another MRI, a sagittal section, a cross section. Okay, the head would be up here, the tail would be down here. And this is the spinal cord, and that's not what it's supposed to look like. It's got a hole in the spinal cord. Now, to understand, where did the name Syrinx come from? Does anybody know where Syrinx comes? A little more interaction here. Syrinx. Anybody know where Syrinx? Who is Syrinx? I've told some of you this story. Who's Syrinx?
A Greek.
Yes, you see, you listened to me. And you were actually, usually my patients, you know, they'll tune me out a little. And
I don't have that condition, but I heard you.
So Syrinx was a goddess of water. It was a Greek mythology. And she was, like all goddesses, beautiful. And you know that humans can't be with goddesses. And so Pan was a satyr, was half animal, half human. He lusted after Syrinx. And Syrinx ran down to the waterside, down to the where her sisters were. And when Pan put his arms around her, she turned into a bundle of reeds. So she turned, and think about reeds or bamboos. They're hollow. And that's what this is, a hollow cord filled with water. So that's where the name Syrinx or Syringomyelia came from. Okay, so next time I ask it, you're going to have to remember some Greek mythology. But if you go, there are beautiful paintings around the world of Syrinx. And there's even a flute song called Syrinx, and it's beautiful. It has a very plaintive, it's a very sad song, and it's very fitting for this condition. Very sad music. I should play it sometime. Next time I'll play the song Syrinx. So, what happened to cause Chiari and Syrinx? We don't know why this happens. But what we know, there are three things that happen. And this is another cartoon. The cerebellar tonsils come down through the opening in the bottom of the skull. There's abnormal flow of the fluid that's supposed to flow around your brain and spinal cord. And when you develop a Syrinx, you get a hole in the spinal cord because the fluid goes in through the spaces and starts destroying your spinal cord. And these things occur chronically because I saw a patient back, we saw a patient back the other day who recounted that. I said, how long have you had headaches? And she said, most of my life. And she had this enormous Chiari and Syrinx. And I said, and what did they tell you? That I had headaches. And so these can be chronic issues and chronic problems, often misdiagnosed. So not to be critical, but to be understanding that this is a common, that you are not alone when you say, boy, it took a few years for me to go to the doctor and figure out that I had something more than migraines. Okay. So I want to remind, I say this again, we're not here to, you know, there are many opinions about how to diagnose Chiari and Syringomyelia and how to treat it. In fact, the other night I was up for several hours writing a commentary for one of our neurosurgical journals about different approaches to treating Chiari and Syringomyelia. And this was from a group in Turkey, okay, Istanbul. And so We argue in America what the right treatment is, and we argue around the world. We don't know. So we're not here to cast aspersions. And one of the things that's a signature piece of this condition, both Chiari and Syringomyelia, that is so terrible is pain. Okay? Because pain is the signature piece of this. Whether it's the headaches that you get, tussive headaches that you get with straining, or whether it's the residual of the Syrinx, which leaves you with neurologic deficits the rest of your life. Okay? But there are good news. People, now, so what is, one of the important things, I want to read you this. According to the International Association for the Study of Pain, pain is defined as an unpleasant sensory or an emotional, conscious experience associated with actual and potential tissue damage. Although unpleasant, pain plays an important role as a warning sign of harm, giving rise to a number of physiologic, physical, psychologic, and behavioral responses to injury, and initiating the processes necessary for recuperation and repair. Therefore, pain should be considered as a highly adaptive mechanism aimed at preventing further harm to the organism and exaggerating the injury due to the highly subjective nature of pain. That's when the doctor tells you it's in your head. Of course it's in your head. It's highly subjective nature of pain. Depending on the individually perceived and psychologically appraised situations, pain can occur even in the absence of tissue damage or when tissue damage is completely healed. And that's very important for patients with Chiari and Syringomyelia. The pain, the International Association for the Study of Pain is telling you that even after the condition that you're concerned about is treated, you can still have pain. Okay? Very, very tough concept to swallow. So when we talk about making a diagnosis, we teach our students that, you know, it's a three-legged stool. You can't just look at the x-rays. Okay? 90% of the diagnosis is going to be made with your ear. It's going to be the symptoms that the patient tells you. They're going to tell you what they have. They don't know what it is, but they're going to tell you, my shunt's not working. It's broken. Okay, how do you know? I don't know. I just know this is how I feel when my shunt is not working. Or I have pain. I have burning in my arms. Okay? So it's the symptoms. 80% of the diagnosis we make are based on the symptoms. Then there's the signs. Those are the exam, when the doctor examines you. And the last thing is the radiology. So 3 things you need to make the diagnosis. So what's the history? You know, what do we do? Okay. So a lot of people know that, well, this cine is not working, that one of the things we do, one of the first questions, the myths, that you have to have a cine MRI CSF flow study. Not everybody does that. I do it. Simply, initially 20 years ago, I did it as a research tool. That's one of the ways I got interested in Chiari and Syringomyelia research. The reason CSF physiology, cine MRI CSF, these CSF flow studies are important is when the patient comes back to you and they've had an operation and they're not perfect, as many patients are not after the operation, you want to know, did you fix what you thought you fixed? So did you fix the back of the skull and the brain? And is the cerebrospinal fluid that percolates around your brain, still percolating around your brain? Before the operation, it was obstructed. There was a block. Now, is it flowing again? But not everybody does that, and it's important to note that in some institutions at some places around the country, there's not a comfort level, because what we do to do these studies is we do them on normal people first, normal subjects, people without any symptoms, to know what normal looks like, so that when we see someone with Chiari, we know the difference of the two. So that's important. Next thing that people always ask is, what about the bone opening? If you're going to operate on Chiari malformations, you have to take off bone. How much bone? How many people have asked that? How much bone do you take off? Well, the answer is how much is too much and how little is not enough. And that is an issue. You can take off too much and the brain can sag through that hole, or you can take off too little and you'll be back doing the operation again. Okay? So the answer is the right amount. And here's a young man, 35-year-old man, with a craniectomy. He had an operation, and they put back the bone at the end of it because they didn't want him to have a gap in the back of his head. Now, those of you that had the operation, it's the thickest musculature in your body, the thickest skin, so you can't really poke your brain too well with that little piece of bone missing. So putting the bone back, or in patients where the bone has grown back, particularly children, it's a problem. So that's too little bone taken out. Okay, so this is what happened when I went back and took off the bone. You can see the MRI brain, normal cerebellum, and the fluid behind there. So there is sometimes too little bone taken out. Now this is an example of too much bone taken out, where all this bone was taken out and the whole brain, the cerebellum, is slumping down. Fortunately, this is extremely rare because people know not to take off too much bone because this can happen. Now it can also happen if you have too much fluid in your head, if you have hydrocephalus. Hydrocephalus is associated with Syringomyelia and associated with Chiari. Now there are two main kinds of Chiari that we think about. Chiari 2 occurs with the kids with spina bifida, occurs with the children with spina bifida, myelomeningocele, and almost all those children have hydrocephalus. Most of the patients here probably have Chiari 1 malformations, the ones that I'm looking around the room. Hydrocephalus is rarely, but sometimes associated with it. But it's rare. It's under 10%. Whereas on the other hand, Chiari 2, it's over 80%. So that's important to know. Different Chiaris. So I'm showing you another. How about too much surgery? Well, there are other things that can cause Chiari and Syringomyelia. This is a unfortunate young lady who had a aneurysm rupture in her brain, caused hydrocephalus, caused her brain to herniate through the hole in the bottom, and caused her to get a Syrinx. So there are other causes besides the ones that I was born with it, or I developed it, or I was in a car accident. People that bleed into their head can sometimes develop this problem. So people always ask me, do you open the dura or not open the dura? And that is still one of the great unsolved problems in this operation. So, and that's what I was up last night writing about, is analyzing these papers that some argue don't open the dura and others argue open the dura. So here's it in a nutshell. Okay, we don't have the right answer. Okay, first thing. Number two, if you open the dura, the chance of you having a complication, a cerebrospinal fluid leak, hydrocephalus, pseudomeningocele, arachnoiditis, meningitis is much higher. Okay, just is. Anytime you do a brain tumor operation, anytime you take an intact person and open the covering of their brain. Dura mater means tough mother in Latin. Anytime you open it up, you can get that sort of complication. Now, it doesn't mean you don't do that, okay? If you don't open the dura, okay, the problem is those people have a much smaller chance of getting rid of their Syrinx and getting their symptoms better. So you're damned if you do, you're damned if you don't, sort of situation. Whereas if you don't open the dura, the studies all show that those people often need to, not often, sometimes need to go back for a second operation. If you do open the dura, you have a greater risk of complications. And your doctors will make that decision based on their surgical experience, based on what they have, based on what the MRI shows, based on a discussion with you. As for me, in general, if a patient has a Syrinx, I'll open the dura. Little children under 3 years of age that have a Chiari, oftentimes I don't open the dura. So there is no right answer to this. But this is one of the controversies that neurologists and neurosurgeons discuss all the time. There's no right answer, but you should know the pros and cons. So what does the literature say? And there you go. I had Tom Cruise and show me the money. And so I'm just showing you all the articles. There's a lot of articles, lots of articles. One of the best articles was a meta-analysis where they took all the papers and analyzed them, and they added up all the patients. Now you'll say that's not science when you take all the articles and then you add up all the patients, because they're different surgeons and they did different operations. So here it is again in the literature, the science. Decompression with Duraplasti, opening the dura, is associated with a lower risk of reoperation than without Duraplasti, but has a greater risk for CSF-related complications. Okay? That's the answer. Okay? So, here's an example. So people ask me, well, show me an example of where someone didn't open the dura and you had to reoperate. Here's an answer. Here's somebody who had 3 bony decompressions. They kept going out back and getting more and more bone, and the symptoms didn't go away and the syrinx didn't collapse. So how did we make the diagnosis? We did a cine MRI. We saw that there was no flow in the back of the brain. Looks like a blurrogram to you, but to me it shows no flow in the back of the brain. And so we eventually went in and put a dural patch on it, went in, explored, and fixed all that. So here's an example of where the syrinx collapses, things get better, etc., opening the dura. But there's no right answer to this. Okay. How about another controversy comes up? People ask me, well, I have a syrinx. Why do you operate on the back of my head? Why not just put a shunt in my syrinx? You know, I don't want the back of my head opened up. I have this big syrinx, just drain the syrinx. And here's a young girl that was a 3-year-old that was flown in from Germany, and she has Ondine's curse. You know what Ondine's curse is? Another Greek mythology. Stopped breathing. They stopped breathing. So she came in on a respirator because she wouldn't breathe. And what does she have? If you look at this MRI, here you see, here's, you know, her eye over here, here's her brain. This is again a cut, you know, a profile. And here she had this big syrinx going all the way up in her brainstem, and that's what stopped her from breathing. She would forget to breathe. And what happened is the very good neurosurgeon, no criticism, drained the syrinx, but did not fix the underlying problem, which was the Chiari. So what we do know from all the research we have done is to treat a syrinx associated with the Chiari, you really need to adequately fix the underlying Chiari before the syrinx goes away. So we went back, we fixed the Chiari, the syrinx is gone. She's off the ventilator. So another principle of Chiari and Syringomyelia research and treatment is the following. Treat the underlying disease, which is the Chiari causing the syrinx, is what our beliefs are. How about this? So, you know, one of the things I always tell my students and I tell my patients is perception of success. Okay? Doctors always have a little different perception of success than the patients. Isn't that true? Okay? So we often look at the x-rays and it looks great, but the patient says, I'm not feeling well. So it isn't uncommon after an operation, if you're not feeling well, but the x-ray looks great, there could be something wrong, or it could be just a healing problem. But the things that are the hardest for me as a neurosurgeon are the complications associated with this problem. And there'll be people that tell you that I've never seen a complication, I've never had a complication, or don't get a second opinion on what's wrong with you. And I tell all my patients, walk out of that room and never go back. Because everybody who does surgery sees complications. Now, some may blame it on the patient, but it is the surgeon's complications. And it might be because the disease is difficult to treat, true enough. But there is an incidence of leaking of spinal fluid. There is an incidence of developing a pseudomeningocele, which is a fluid pocket that doesn't leak through your skin, but leaks outside your brain. Hydrocephalus, the increased fluid in your head. We see that. And remember I told you with Chiari 1s, a small percentage of those people really have underlying hydrocephalus, that increased pressure in their head. And then, of course, Syringomyelia. So we can show you a picture. I can tell you, I saw a patient on Monday with Shannon, a couple of patients, who had absolutely successful operations. Their Chiari decompressed, their Syrinx collapsed. But they still had numbness of their hands, tingling in their hands, terrible burning, because Syringomyelia is a chronic problem. And now, although the surgeon says, your successful operation, pats himself on the back, the patient still has a neurologic deficit and they still hurt. And so the chronicity, the chronic nature of this condition is important to understand. And a lot of times, you know, I always tell my children, they're not teenagers anymore, but when they're said life's all about expectations. If you expect to be playing second base for the Yankees, you're probably going to be a little disappointed in life. But if you set your goals somewhere else, you might not be that as disappointed. It's the same thing with an operation. The expectations need to be set correctly. Anybody who tells you that, you know what, we're going to cure your Syringomyelia, you're not going to have any more pains or symptoms, is probably a little too enthusiastic, because this is a chronic problem. And so I saw two patients whose Syrinx collapsed, but they didn't need any more surgery. Their surgery was a success, but they had burning and numbness, and they needed medication to control the pain associated with this. So the surgery can look good, the MRIs can look good, there could be no complications, but you can still have a chronic problem from this. While you can treat the Chiari, the Syringomyelia, what I always tell my patients with Syrinxes is those symptoms often, some of them persist. Why does that happen? Why do people have persistent symptoms? Because the Syrinx causes sometimes permanent damage to the spinal cord. Permanent damage to the spinal cord. And the problem with the central nervous system is it's great. God made it perfect the first time, but once it's damaged, it doesn't regenerate. Someday we might be able to make the brain cells regenerate, but once we lose those brain cells and those spinal cord cells, they don't come back. So that's the issue. Again, people ask me, okay, I'm going to get a Duraplasti. My neurosurgeon told me I'm going to get a Duraplasti. What do you use? Now, I've been around long enough that I've gone through about 30 renditions of what we've used. Everything from, we used to fillet open the side of people's legs and use fascia lata. I met a patient about a month ago who that's how they were treated. They use all kinds of Dacron patches and bovine pericardium, and and I happen to use pericranium. I use tissue from the patient. I always figured, ever since my kids started eating organic and natural, I figured, okay, we're going to just keep it all in the family. I don't know if that's the right answer. I think that whatever the surgeon does is probably what they're most comfortable with, but there is no randomized study. There is no study that says this is better than that. Okay, patients ask me all the time, why aren't you putting in bovine pericardium, or why aren't you doing this or that? I use tissue from the patient. I find that works better. But it's not for all neurosurgeons, and not all patients get that. So that's another myth, that one works better than the other. I arrived at this after a couple of decades because it's what works best in my hands and my patients. So what about the hydrocephalus? This is one of the most confounding things about Chiari and Syringomyelia. Hydrocephalus comes from the Greek word hydro, water, cephalus, head. It's an abnormal accumulation of fluid. And it's probably the most common congenital problem we see in children. 1 out of 1,000 children are born with it. 1 out of 1,000 children. Pretty common. Probably close to 750,000 hospital discharges a year in this country alone, and it's over $1 billion of national health costs a year. So one of the things that people ask me is, so pressure, intracranial pressure in the head, increased fluid. Here's an example of an extreme example of hydrocephalus. This is an extreme example of hydrocephalus. The fluid, this is a CT scan, and too much fluid, and you can see the head's too big. Now, in this country, we treat them when they're babies. But if you go to Africa or other countries, oftentimes they don't have the equipment, the shunt equipment or anything to treat the underlying hydrocephalus. So the reason I bring this up is patients always ask me about the hydrocephalus issue. If you don't have big fluid-filled cavities in your head, which most patients with Chiari 1 do not have, they do not have hydrocephalus. What's normal pressure? I had a lumbar puncture, or I had a drain put in my head. What is normal? So I just show you that the pressure in your head is normal if it's under 3 for a baby, and if it's under 20 millimeters of water for an adult. So if someone said, I went to the emergency room and they thought I had meningitis and they did a lumbar puncture and my pressure was 36 centimeters of water, or 236 centimeters or 360 millimeters of water, that's high. That's too high. That's increased fluid in the head. That's, there you go. That's what happens. So difference between hydrocephalus on the left, increased fluid in the head, and normal on the right. See the difference? Okay. So those cavities are enlarged on the left, normal on the right. And why do people get in trouble with increased pressure in the head? What happens to people that have a Chiari, too big a brain and too small a skull? Well, it's like everything else. What happens is you only have, your skull is a fixed box. And if you have a brain tumor or a blood clot, or you have increased fluid building up in your brain, the pressure goes up. As every drop of water you add, or if it's a brain tumor, every centimeter of mass, cubic centimeter mass, makes the pressure go all the way up. So, you know, you might do well for a while. Why do people do so well? Well, they do well for a while, and then it's the tipping point. All of a sudden, the curve is vertical, which means that you can do well for a while. You add that one more drop of water, and the seesaw tips the other way, and the pressure in your brain goes all the way up. And that's why people can live with chronic conditions like Chiari and Syringomyelia for a while. And 25% of my patients will tell me, I was doing great, I was okay, had headaches, but I was okay. Then I got in a car accident. That's the classic one, 25%. Then I fell. Then something happened. We don't know why that happens, that pushes the Chiari over, pushes that, but we think it's some blood in the head that probably gets mixed with the fluid, and the patients are doing fine, and then it sends them over. And they might even not, you know, they've never seen a doctor for years, and then all of a sudden they're seeing a doctor and they're being diagnosed. We only have theories why people, you know, according to the people that walk in my office, were doing fine with their headaches until they fell, or until they hit their head. Another issue. This is just showing a picture. This is the duramata, and this is the arachnoid over the cerebellum here. This is what it looks like. These are what the cerebellar tonsils. Here's where the skull ends, right over here. And you can see the herniation of the tonsils. And what I want to point out is the tonsils being white is not normal. They're compressed, the chronic changes. They're white and shiny because they're not too alive. That's what it looks like. I know this might be gross for some people. Probably shouldn't have shown it after dinner or before. Okay. I want to stop here. I can go on, talk about tethered cords and other things, but I want to see, it's 7:30, it's getting late. I want to see if people have questions, if I answered some of the myths, some of the questions about failures, concerns. I want this to be interactive. Questions?